While peer-reviewed articles about the life and career of American journalist Dorothy Thompson, 1893 to 1961, are few and far between, articles within the larger context of the organizations and causes she attached her reputation and career to are more plentiful. An example is a scholarship dealing with the American Friends of the Middle East, an organization that Thompson helmed from its inception in 1951 until her departure as president of the organization in 1957. After her death in 1961, though, investigative journalists from Ramparts magazine and the New York Times discovered that the organization was secretly funded by the CIA. JSTOR provided an interesting speech from the executive vice president of Thompson's group, Garland Evans Hopkins. A Methodist clergyman, Hopkins had been sent by his church to Palestine in 1947 to assess the conditions under which the Palestinian refugees were living in the aftermath of the war of that year. Hopkins ran the day-to-day operations of the AFME, and Thompson's involvement was something more than just a figurehead. In 2009, the journal Pakistan Horizons reprinted a speech of Hopkins from his AFME days in 1953. Hopkins declared the Truman administration's Middle Eastern policy is bankrupt. He summed up the attitude of Thompson and other AFME leaders in this way. Quote, a group composed of largely Arab Jews, known as the Zionist group, skilled in propaganda methods and able to bring pressure upon influential people in the American Congress and the American government, having large resources of money at its disposal, misled and deluded the American people into believing that there was room for the refugees of Europe in the land of the Arabs. Unquote. In the speech, he encouraged his Pakistani listeners to consider themselves part of the Middle East, to actively lobby Congress in Washington, D.C., and moreover to organize a propaganda effort. Quote, the lack of skillful informational services on the part of the Middle Eastern countries is a part of the reason why they are not better known in America, Hopkins said. End quote. The speech is revealing not only because it points to the ideological bent of the AFME, but because it betrays a resentment toward what Hopkins called the not completely honest Zionist lobby in the United States. While the speech discusses Thompson's organization and what it stood for, other scholars did examine the effect that her stands on Israel affected and how they affected her life and career. Lindy Gordon's Why Dorothy Thompson Lost Her Job, Political Columnists and the Press Wars of the 1930s and 1940s, focuses on the end of Thompson's employment at the Republican-leaning New York Herald Tribune in 1941, and her later firing from the New York Post 6 years later. In 1936, Thompson became the first female columnist to write a 3 times weekly column for a major market U.S. newspaper. In 1940, Thompson and her editor, Helen Reed, led the charge for Wendell Willkie to win the Republican nomination for president that year. Early in the year, Thompson declared publicly her support for the Wall Street electricity magnate from Indiana. An internationalist and an anti-Nazi, Willkie surprisingly won the GOP nomination against isolationists such as Senators Robert Taft and Arthur Vandenberg after a wave of support at the Philadelphia Convention. Thompson began to have second thoughts about Willkie's candidacy after he began to campaign for the support of isolationist constituencies in the Republican base, and after Franklin D. Roosevelt launched a charm offensive to win her support. Even though Thompson declared FDR to be tired and unable to lead the charge against Hitler, Roosevelt invited her to the White House to dissuade her from what he called this Willkie business. When Thompson flipped her support to the president for an unprecedented third term in October 1940. In the pages of the New York Herald Tribune, she betrayed her friends, her employer, and the party it supported. Subscribers and advertisers were furious with the about-face. The publishers, Helen and Ogden Reed, had a long-standing agreement with Thompson that she could write what she pleased, but an endorsement of the man despised by Republican industrialists and anti-New Dealers was just too much. Thompson's contract was not renewed, and she resumed her career in her column at the New York Post. Gordon discusses the issues that ended Thompson's post-war career at the Post as well. First, Thompson argued for a soft peace with Germany. She opposed the Morgenthau Plan, which would reduce the nation to an agrarian one, devoid of industry. She presciently argued as well that Germany was essential to a post-war peace and essential to post-war stability, and on top of that, she opposed the Nuremberg trials. Her positions caused consternation among readers of the Post, then a largely leftist working-class Jewish readership, and with a strong African-American following. Both the editor Ted Thackeray and his wife, publisher Dorothy Schiff, were Jewish and pro-Zionist. Thackeray accused Thompson of bias in favor of Germany and against the Zionist cause, and dropped her column in 1947. Although she would remain a syndicated columnist, she no longer had an outlet in New York, and she lost her most influential readers. Gordon points to changes in, quote, the nature and presentation of the news, the declining influence of print journalism, and the competing rights of journalists, editors, publishers, broadcasters, and the government to shape information and thus to control the political education of the American public, end quote, as contributing factors to Thompson's fall. She portrays a battle between newspaper publishers and politicians that began in the 1930s and ended with World War II. The war aligned the interests of government and politicians and journalists and newspapers in such a way that columnists like Thompson, who drove a political debate during the Depression and the run-up to World War II, lost a profound amount of influence after the war's end. In other words, newspaper advertisers and ownership could restrain the power of even their most star personalities. Gordon gives scant attention, though, to the role that Thompson's criticism of the Zionist project in Palestine had in the loss of the New York Post as her flagship newspaper. Still a syndicated columnist, Thompson's vocal sympathies for the refugees won the attention of Arabists in the State Department and the U.S. intelligence apparatus. Jeffrey P. Levin's Arab Students, American Jewish Insecurities, and the End of Pro-Arab Politics in Mainstream America, 1952 to 1973, discusses the role that the AFME, headed by Thompson, played in the, quote, removal of pro-Arab politics from mainstream political discourse. In March 1950, Thompson published an incendiary article entitled, Do Israeli Ties Conflict with U.S. Citizenship? America Demands a Single Loyalty, arguing that Zionist Jews in the United States ran the risk of, quote, dual allegiance. The woman who had once led the charge against Hitler's persecution of the Jews in the 1930s now stood accused of anti-Semitism. In 1951, Kermit Kim Roosevelt and former diplomat William Eddy formed the AFME to oppose Zionism and to promote U.S.-Arab relations. William Eddy recruited Dorothy Thompson, using the famed journalist and broadcaster as the face of his operation. Roosevelt joined the CIA and soon began directing government funds to underwrite the AFME. The existence of the AFME, Levin contends, a group of respected individuals supporting U.S.-Arab ties, attests to some support for pro-Arab policies. But the inability of the AFME to raise sufficient private donations to compete with Zionists indicates the lack of breadth and depth of pro-Arab support, end quote. Possibly. But U.S. policies remained clearly pro-Arab during the Eisenhower administration. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser accepted Soviet aid to build the Aswan Dam and recognized Communist China, the administration soured on Nasser's brand of Arab nationalism. The AFME began to be countered by the American Jewish Committee, the AJC, which authored a confidential 1955 report describing the American Friends of the Middle East, headed by Dorothy Thompson, as a main purveyor of Arab propaganda in the United States. By the time Thompson resigned from the AFME in 1957, her reputation was sullied by accusations of anti-Semitism, and she retired in ill health from her column a year later. She died in 1961, but it would be another 6 years before the power behind the AFME would be revealed and the organization dissolved. Thank you.